The successful execution of the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, known as Operation Overlord, hinged upon many critical factors, including the daring deployment of thousands of airborne troops. These paratroopers were launched into the occupied territory hours before the main seaborne landings, tasked with sowing chaos behind German lines and securing vital objectives. Among the most critical of these objectives was the Fière Bridge, a seemingly small crossing over the Merderet River. The defense of this narrow span by the paratroopers of the United States 82nd Airborne Division quickly became one of the most intense and pivotal stands of the entire invasion. The actions taken by these lightly armed airborne soldiers at Fière were essential. They faced repeated and determined German counterattacks featuring both heavy infantry and armor. By seizing and holding this key bridge, the Americans effectively blocked crucial lines of communication and transit, thereby preventing German reinforcements from reaching the vulnerable beachheads where Allied troops were landing. The tenacity and professional training displayed by the paratroopers allowed them to withstand overwhelming force, confirming the strategic value of the airborne phase of the operation despite the inherent dangers and scattering that came with jumping into the night sky. This grueling and vital confrontation determined whether German forces could easily move across the Normandy countryside to repel the invasion. Background and context of the airborne operation. The airborne drops were meticulously designed to form a vital component of the overall invasion strategy on June 6, 1944. However, the reality of combat meant that through both deliberate design and the chaotic circumstances of night deployment, the paratroopers of the three Allied airborne divisions ultimately achieved multiple strategic goals. Their primary missions focused on the seizure of critical crossroads and communications routes. This maneuver was intended to isolate the coastal defenses, preventing powerful German reinforcement units, particularly armored divisions, from swiftly mobilizing and reaching the landing zones. The paratroopers were mandated to hold these vital points until the main Allied forces could advance inland from the beachheads and establish a link-up. The inherent disorder of the drops, often caused by enemy anti-aircraft fire or planes veering off course, scattered many units miles away from their designated drop zones. Instead of achieving perfect cohesion, many paratroopers were forced to improvise. They often banded together into small, disorganized groups and then either attempted to locate their original targets or decided to inflict damage wherever they found themselves. This unforeseen distribution of American forces further complicated the situation for the German defenders. The German command found its strength diluted as it was forced to react to a myriad of small, decentralized assaults, making it difficult to determine which attacks posed the most significant strategic threat. The particular airborne operation involving the 82nd Airborne Division, known throughout the military as the All-Americans, was codenamed Boston. The division itself consisted of several regiments specifically assigned for the initial jump. One of the division's two assigned parachute regiments was the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Owens. This regiment was not new to high-intensity combat, having already served in military campaigns in Sicily and Italy before being relocated to England to prepare for the massive invasion of Western Europe. The other primary regiment, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had also seen action in Italy but had arrived back to England significantly under strength due to heavy casualties. Consequently, the 504th could not be brought up to full combat strength in time to participate in the critical D-Day operation. To compensate, two other parachute infantry regiments, the 507th and the 508th, were attached to the 82nd Airborne Division for the invasion. Although many soldiers in the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment were replacements for men who had been lost fighting in the Mediterranean theater, they maintained a high level of training and motivation, a characteristic inherent in airborne units which only accepted volunteers. The strategic plan assigned to the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment centered on the French crossroads town of Saint-Mary-Église. The regiment was subdivided into 3 battalions, each with distinct tasks.
The 1st Battalion, designated 1/505th, led by Major Frederick Kellum, received the crucial mission of seizing and holding 2 bridges that crossed the Merderet River. These 2 objectives were the bridge at Fière and the bridge at Chief du Pont. The 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Ben Vandervert, was tasked with occupying the area immediately north of St. Mary-Église. Their role was specifically to block the vital road leading toward the port city of Cherbourg. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, was given the assignment of capturing the town of St. Mary-Église itself. The location of the town was strategically paramount, as it sat directly on the N13 road, situated west of Utah Beach. Any German counterattacks launched against either Utah Beach or Omaha Beach would necessitate the use of this road for swift movement and reinforcement. The bridge at Fière, the specific target of the 1st Battalion, lay a few miles to the west of St. Mary-Église. This structure was often referred to simply as a causeway. It was a relatively small bridge that connected the road on both sides of the narrow Merderet River. The road itself was slightly elevated above the surrounding terrain, because the area was prone to frequent flooding, particularly during the rainy season. In June of 1944, the Merderet River should naturally have been shallow and narrow. However, in preparation for the invasion, the German forces had opened the locks located at Carentan, causing a massive inundation of the terrain. This deliberate flooding turned the area immediately surrounding the bridge into either marshland or sodden, impassable farm fields. Near the bridge, just to the south, sat a small manor house. Furthermore, the small hamlet of Coquigny was located just over half a mile west of the bridge along the main road. Fière itself was not a large settlement, consisting of little more than a small cluster of buildings situated a few hundred yards to the northwest of the bridge. The terrain thus funneled any assault toward the narrow causeway. On the German side, several military units were stationed in the area as part of the overall defense strategy. The commander responsible for the entire German defense was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had a specific desire to place his crucial reserve panzer divisions near the coast, allowing them to respond rapidly to the anticipated Allied landings. However, this plan was overruled and the tanks were held significantly farther back from the coast, rendering them unavailable during the initial crucial hours of the invasion. Compounding this issue, these armored units could not be deployed or moved without receiving the personal authorization of Adolf Hitler. Rommel was therefore compelled to rely on less powerful infantry formations, supplemented by whatever small armored and artillery units he could gather. The local command responsible for the area targeted by the airborne landings was the 84th Corps. The German Wehrmacht units that ultimately engaged in the heavy fighting for the Fière Bridge were predominantly under the command of the 91st Air Landing Division, known in German as the 91. Luftlande Division. The headquarters for this division was located approximately 9 miles directly west of St. Mary-Église. Like many other units stationed in the countryside located behind the potential Allied landing beaches, the 91st Division was assigned the role of a rapid reaction force. Its mission was to respond swiftly to any area that came under attack, whether the assault was a beach landing or an airborne intrusion. The 91st Air Landing Division was a relatively new unit, having only been raised at the beginning of 1944. Its main fighting strength comprised 2 grenadier regiments, specifically numbered 1057 and 1058. Each of these regiments consisted of 3 battalions. They were supported by specialized companies, including an infantry cannon company and an anti-tank company. The division also included a fusilier battalion. This battalion contained 3 independent companies, one specializing in anti-tank warfare, one dedicated to anti-aircraft defense, and one composed of bicycle troops for rapid, if light, movement. Additionally, the 91st Air Landing Division possessed an engineer battalion and an artillery regiment. This artillery regiment was equipped with 24 105mm mountain howitzers and 12 88mm PaK-43 anti-tank guns. The regiments of the 91st Air Landing Division were positioned west and northwest of St. Mary-Église. They had been supplied with equipment specifically chosen for their intended role in air landing operations, a structure roughly analogous to the glider regiments utilized by American airborne divisions. For instance, their mountain howitzers were lighter models designed to be more easily transported by air landing troops. However, this specialization created an immediate logistical problem. These howitzers fired ammunition of a different size than the standard German 105mm weapon. The division had only a single basic load of this specialized ammunition on hand. Furthermore, the division was generally under strength, partially trained, and suffered from a common difficulty among German units in Normandy, a severe lack of transport vehicles.
Acknowledging these existing difficulties, the German command had attached 2 additional non-organic units to the 91st Air Landing Division. One of these was Parachute Regiment 6, a German airborne unit that had recently arrived in the area at the end of May, positioned south of St. Mary-Église and near the town of Carentan.
The second key attachment was Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion 100. The primary function of this battalion was to prepare new tank crews for combat. For training purposes, the unit utilized older French tanks that had been captured during the 1940 invasion. This unit was organized into two companies, collectively possessing approximately 25 Renault 35s and Hotchkiss H-39s. Their entire inventory of actual German tanks consisted of a single Panzer Mark III. These combined German units were fully expected to react with speed to any Allied attacks, using the very network of roads and communication lines that the American paratroopers were ordered to interdict on the night of June 6th. The American 82nd Airborne Division began its landings around 1 o'clock in the morning on D-Day. Word of the intrusion reached the German 84th Corps just 11 minutes later. Initially, the reports generated significant confusion, a reaction that was not unusual for the opening moments of an enemy attack. However, based on past experience, the German forces immediately recognized the necessity of reacting quickly with localized counterattacks. Their goal was to prevent the enemy paratroopers from organizing effectively and forming any coherent, sustainable defense. It took a substantial amount of time for the 91st Division to mobilize and begin its movement. This delay was attributable both to the general confusion surrounding the sudden attack and the division's existing lack of sufficient transport capabilities. Making matters worse, the division commander, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falle, was away at the time, having been attending a map exercise in Rennes. He was forced to drive rapidly back toward his unit in the darkness of June 6th. As Falle and his aides sped along the dark French roads, the fortunes of war turned decisively against them. An American officer, Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, the commander of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment's headquarters company, was standing alongside the road and questioning a French civilian when Falle's car suddenly appeared. Brannan and the small handful of paratroopers with him immediately opened fire, raking the car with a concentrated burst of gunfire. Both German officers were killed in the ambush. Lieutenant Brannan later successfully found the 82nd Airborne Division headquarters. General Matthew Ridgway, the division commander, was informed of the event. Brannan, laughing, recounted how he had successfully killed a German division commander. General Ridgway, reacting to the gravity of the overall situation, responded, "Well, in our present situation, killing division commanders does not strike me as being particularly hilarious. But I congratulate you. I'm glad it was a German division commander you got." The death of General Lieutenant Falle caused further substantial confusion within the German division, which now lacked its commanding officer. Leadership responsibilities were temporarily assumed by Oberst or Colonel Klaus Klosterkemper. Simultaneously, small groups of American paratroopers conducted harassing raids on the 91st headquarters. Due to the confusion and the darkness of the early morning, the Germans often misinterpreted these small raids as attacks by much larger enemy forces. By 3:30 o'clock in the morning, the 91st Division had completely lost communication with the troops who were defending the critical La Fière Bridge.
The stand at La Fière Bridge. While confusion reigned on the German side, Lieutenant John Dolan and his company, A Company, of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, were moving purposefully toward their assigned objective, a few miles to the east. Lieutenant Dolan was one of the fortunate American paratroopers who landed exactly where he was supposed to be. While many of the planes dropping the division had been scattered by enemy anti-aircraft fire or had veered off course, the C-47 transport aircraft carrying Dolan and his men had arrived perfectly over their designated drop zone. As the plane flew straight and true, the paratroopers stood ready, hooking their parachute lines to the static line within the fuselage. They performed their equipment checks while German tracers flashed past their planes, sometimes hearing rounds striking the wings. The signal to jump, a green light, illuminated the compartment, and the lead soldier, followed by the rest, leapt into the night sky around 1:30 o'clock in the morning. Private Arthur D. Filippo, a paratrooper in the 505th, recalled watching the tracers and praying that God would get him down safely, allowing him to take care of himself afterward. Upon landing without issue, Dolan quickly began the process of determining his exact location. Within half an hour, he successfully located a T-intersection formed by two dirt roads. The horizontal arm of this intersection ran east-west, and the vertical arm ran north-south. Both roads were approximately 8 or 10 feet wide. This confirmed that his unit had landed precisely in its assigned drop zone, hitting the target exactly. Dolan realized the north-south dirt road led directly south to another road,
which connected the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and the bridge over the Merderet River at La Fière. This specific bridge was Dolan's mission. A Company had been ordered to seize the bridge and hold it until relieved by advancing friendly forces. A Company experienced the expected difficulties inherent in assembling after a night jump. The profound darkness complicated the effort to gather the men into their assigned squads and platoons. Nevertheless, about an hour before dawn broke, A Company was finally ready. Remarkably, 90% of the company was accounted for. Dolan later attributed this high accountability rate to the extensive night training the unit had undergone before the invasion and the effective actions taken by the officers and the non-commissioned officers. With A Company assembled and prepared, Dolan led them directly toward the bridge. As the morning sun slowly rose to their left, the Americans proceeded south along the narrow dirt road that Dolan had identified shortly after his landing. The rigorous hours spent studying maps and terrain models prior to the jump were proving invaluable. Soon, they reached another T intersection. A turn to the left would have led them toward Sainte-Mère-Église, but Dolan knew to turn right, heading toward the objective, the bridge. At this point, Dolan encountered his battalion executive officer, Major James McGinnity, who chose to accompany Dolan and the men of A Company. As they prepared to move out, a German motorcycle suddenly appeared, racing east toward Sainte-Mère-Église. The rider passed without spotting the concealed American paratroopers, who allowed him to pass unmolested. The company then crossed to the south side of the road before continuing their movement. The 1st platoon took the lead, followed by the company headquarter element, with the 3rd and 2nd platoons trailing behind in that sequence. They were afforded some level of concealment by a massive hedgerow that separated the soldiers from the road. Almost immediately after beginning this movement, Lieutenant Dolan lost contact with the 1st platoon. As a result, the 3rd platoon assumed the lead position. When the company reached a point approximately 700 to 800 yards from the bridge, the lane split. One fork of the road led southeast, directly toward the bridge. This specific dirt road was bordered by thick hedgerows on both sides. As the paratroopers advanced toward the bridge, they encountered an open field, roughly 100 yards deep and 75 yards wide. Dolan immediately recognized this open space as a dangerous place where the Germans would likely establish defensive positions. Since the 3rd platoon was leading the advance, Dolan instructed its platoon leader, Lieutenant Donald Coxon, to send his scouts forward to conduct a vital reconnaissance mission. Lieutenant Coxon gathered a few men and made the decision to accompany them himself. Dolan later recorded that Coxon possessed immense personal courage, but he lacked the resolve to order his men out into danger without going with them. Only moments after the scouting party moved out into the exposed terrain, a German machine gun commenced firing from the far side of the field. Lieutenant Coxon and one of the scouts, a man named Ferguson, were both killed instantly. The Americans returned fire immediately, and bullets began snapping across the field between the opposing sides.
Dolan realized the absolute necessity of moving quickly to dislodge the German position. He ordered his 2nd platoon leader, Lieutenant Presnell, to lead his platoon in a wide movement around the right flank of the German defenses. The order was to flank the enemy position and, if possible, continue advancing all the way to the bridge itself. Concurrently, Major McGinty and Lieutenant Dolan led the 3rd platoon in a movement around the left flank, aiming to eliminate the machine gun position. Lieutenant Presnell successfully executed his maneuver and soon reached the bridge without encountering any further enemy fire. The 3rd platoon advanced carefully until the men believed they were roughly even with the estimated position of the machine gun, at which point they moved in to engage. Major McGinty took the immediate lead, with Lieutenant Dolan following just a few steps behind him. A high, exceptionally thick hedgerow ran along their left. Dolan was convinced the machine gun was positioned on the other side of this natural barrier. As they crept forward, the air was suddenly filled with rifle and submachine gun fire that tore through the dense hedgerow, resulting in the death of Major McGinty. Dolan watched the leaves on the hedge shaking violently as the bullets ripped through it. He immediately used these spots as a reference point to return fire with his Thompson submachine gun. The continuous enemy fire was snapping all around him. Dolan managed to spot an empty German foxhole nearby and dove into it for cover. Once covered, he maintained a steady volume of fire with his Thompson. Unfortunately, the 3rd Platoon's assistant platoon leader, Lieutenant McLaughlin, and his radio operator were both struck by enemy fire. The lieutenant later succumbed to his wounds that day. Additional fire began erupting from the direction of the bridge, effectively pinning the American paratroopers down for at least an hour. Every time Lieutenant Dolan attempted to move or shift position, German fire instantly drove him back to the relative safety of his cover. He could distinctly hear more firing taking place down closer to the bridge itself. Finally, Dolan risked moving again, and this time received no return fire. He quickly realized that the Germans had pulled back from their immediate positions. He returned to the platoon's position and instructed the sergeants and corporals to reorganize the remaining men and hold their current location. Dashing across the road, Dolan found his 1st platoon advancing toward the bridge. He ordered their leader, Lieutenant Oakley, to continue moving to the bridge and to immediately dig in on the north side of the road to establish a solid defensive position. Dolan pressed onward and soon encountered his regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ekman, along with a group of paratroopers belonging to the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 508th's assigned operational area lay a few miles further west. Realizing that the initial German defense had retreated and the vital bridge was now in American hands, Dolan dispatched a runner for the 3rd Platoon, ordering them to move up to the bridge and dig in on the south side of the road. While the defense preparations were underway, Dolan realized that not all of the German forces had withdrawn. Approximately 10 to 12 German soldiers were hiding on the 2nd floor of a stucco farmhouse situated south of the bridge, a building known as the Manoir. As Lieutenant Colonel Ekman and Lieutenant Dolan surveyed the bridge structure, the trapped Germans opened fire. They maintained their fire for about 20 minutes before ultimately surrendering. A squad of paratroopers from the 508th then took the enemy troops prisoner. To complete his defensive preparations, Dolan placed his 2nd platoon about 400 yards east of the bridge, establishing a rear guard to protect the company's vulnerable flank. By 2:30 o'clock in the afternoon, the paratroopers were fully prepared to defend the Fière Bridge. The American forces now controlled the eastern side of the crossing and held the Manoir farmhouse. As the day progressed, more American troops arrived to reinforce the position. Major Kellum, the battalion commander, soon appeared accompanied by his operations officer, Captain Dale Royston. They brought their command post personnel and several much-needed machine gun and mortar teams, significantly adding welcome firepower to the defense.
One platoon from B Company was integrated into the defensive line, along with a collection of stray paratroopers who had been separated from their original units during the chaotic drop. A platoon of combat engineers also arrived. These engineers were specifically assigned the grim task of destroying the bridge if, under extreme pressure, it became necessary to prevent German armor from crossing. With all these additional soldiers now in place, Dolan began a thorough inspection of his forward positions. He observed that the road leading west from the bridge was essentially a raised causeway. On either side of this elevated road, the ground consisted of marshland for roughly 1,000 yards. This natural choke point would prove advantageous, making any frontal assault on the American line extremely difficult for the advancing Germans. Some of the paratroopers bravely dashed across the bridge and proceeded to lay mines along the road. Others managed to push a broken-down German truck from the Manoir property and onto the road, positioning it to create a physical block on the eastern end of the bridge. A company belonging to the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment soon arrived from the east. They joined forces with the squad of the 508th already present, and the entire combined group then successfully crossed the bridge and headed west toward their own assigned objective. Approximately 1 hour later, a few of these soldiers reappeared, retreating through the difficult marshland. These survivors crossed the Merderet River, which, despite the flooded marshland, remained relatively shallow. Dolan's men assisted them in getting out of the water. German machine gun fire then began to rain down upon the American positions. Lieutenant Dolan was certain that a major enemy attack was imminent. Fortunately, A Company received one final crucial reinforcement just before the German assault began. Dolan secured a single 57mm anti-tank gun, which was immediately assigned to protect the vital bridge. He strategically placed the gun near his command post, approximately 150 yards from the bridge, where the road curved away to the right. This positioning afforded the gun crew an excellent field of fire, covering the bridge and the road, while also providing some degree of cover from direct enemy fire.
Dolan also had 3 bazooka teams under his command. 2 of these teams belonged to his own A Company, while the third came from another unit. The A Company teams dug in on opposite sides of the American end of the bridge, one team positioned on the left and one on the right. Because the road was a raised causeway, the teams were forced to dig their foxholes below the level of the road for maximum cover. This meant that they were required to emerge from their protective holes to engage and fire at anything moving along the roadway. The 3rd bazooka team dug in farther to the south of the bridge, where better natural cover was available. A few mortar teams completed the American heavy weapons inventory, but they possessed such low reserves of ammunition that they could only be utilized in absolute emergencies. With all the defenses fully deployed, Dolan, accompanied by Major Kellum and Captain Royston, conducted a final inspection. The German machine gun fire began to increase in intensity. Then a trio of tanks appeared on the road in the distance. Dolan was unable to identify their specific type, but initially thought they resembled a Panzer Mark IV. In reality, these armored vehicles consisted of 2 captured French Renault 35s and 1 Hotchkiss H-39, advancing with infantry support from Grenadier Regiment 1057. Marcus Heim and Leonard Peterson comprised the American bazooka team positioned on the south side of the bridge. Heim recounted watching the enemy tank slowly approach, rounding a curve in the road across the bridge. He observed the commander of the lead tank rise up from his hatch to survey the area. An American machine gun team positioned to Heim's left immediately opened fire, successfully killing the exposed tank commander.
Within seconds of this event, the Germans unleashed a torrent of fire, encompassing both the tank's cannon and machine gun fire in the infantry's small arms. The Americans returned fire, and a general, desperate firefight erupted. The 2 leading German tanks advanced toward the bridge, maintaining a distance of 15 to 20 yards between them, while the 3rd tank trailed roughly 50 yards behind. Each of the tanks poured continuous cannon and machine gun fire at the American troops defending the eastern side of the bridge. When the lead tank closed the distance to within 40 or 50 yards of the bridge structure, both American bazooka teams rose quickly from their foxholes. Despite the terrifying volume of tank fire and small arms fire directed at them, Lieutenant Dolan witnessed both teams calmly loading and firing their bazookas, sending a concentrated hail of rockets toward the closest tank. Heim and Peterson skillfully utilized a large concrete telephone pole for cover while they fired their weapon. The rockets launched by both teams successfully struck the first tank. The hits broke the vehicle's track, causing it to slew violently sideways. Even after being hit, the tank's turret continued to rotate, maintaining fire on the American positions. Heim reloaded repeatedly while Peterson fired again and again until the old tank suddenly burst into flames. The other bazooka team, composed of John Boulderson and Gordon Prine, also achieved multiple hits, resulting in a shared destruction of the vehicle. A German shell then struck the concrete pole that had been shielding Heim and Peterson, causing it to crash down. They jumped out of the way just as it fell. The second enemy tank moved forward, skillfully pushing the burning wreck of the first tank aside, and continued its advance, firing relentlessly. Now lacking the vital cover of the pole, Heim and Peterson moved forward nonetheless to secure a clearer shot at the approaching tank. Heim later recalled, "We kept firing at the second tank and we hit it in the turret where it is connected to the body, also in the track, and with another hit it also went up in flames." Lieutenant Dolan estimated that a mere 30 seconds had elapsed between the successful destruction of the first 2 tanks. However, the 3rd tank still remained a threat. Compounding the problem, the American bazooka teams were critically low on ammunition. Marcus Heim, demonstrating incredible bravery, dashed across the road through the heavy fire to check if the other team had any spare ammunition. He later wrote about the terrifying experience, stating, "I still find it hard to believe I made it to the other side in one piece." On the other side of the bridgehead, a dead paratrooper lay nearby. Heim found that Boulderson and Prine had disappeared. German fire had struck and permanently disabled their bazooka, forcing the team to fall back to a safer cover position. Heim spotted the bazooka, riddled with holes, but fortunately found several rockets still available. Grabbing the precious ammunition, Heim dashed back across the road to rejoin Peterson, miraculously avoiding being hit again. Heim loaded and Peterson fired at the final tank, scoring a direct hit. Soon that 3rd tank was also successfully put out of action. What Heim did not realize in the high-intensity heat of the battle was that the supporting 57mm anti-tank gun, firing from its position farther back, had also struck the 3 enemy tanks with numerous rounds, contributing significantly to their destruction.
Despite its distance from the main action, the Germans eventually spotted the 57mm anti-tank gun and began firing at its position. During the course of the battle, the gun itself was hit several times. German cannon rounds managed to punch several holes directly through the gun's protective shield. Sergeant Elmo Bell of C Company was present at the gun position and noted the extreme dedication of the crew. Each time a crew member was struck and fell, another paratrooper immediately rushed in to keep the vital gun operating. This was possible due to the comprehensive training provided to airborne units, where men were trained on all the heavy weapons they might potentially need to use in combat, including the 57mm anti-tank gun. In total, 7 Americans made the ultimate sacrifice, keeping the 57mm anti-tank gun operational throughout this desperate phase of the battle. Their sacrifice was not in vain, resulting in 3 German tanks knocked out and the Fière Bridge remaining firmly in American hands. With the remaining bazooka crews now dangerously low in ammunition, Major Kellum and Captain Royston bravely moved forward with the much-needed resupply. When they were only 15 to 20 yards from the bridge, heavy German mortar fire suddenly began crashing down around their position. This barrage was perhaps a belated, desperate effort to silence the effective American bazooka teams. Tragically, Major Kellum was killed instantly.
Captain Royston was mortally wounded in the same barrage, dying later that day. This succession of casualties meant that Lieutenant Dolan, by virtue of rank, immediately became the ranking officer at the bridge and assumed command of the battalion. Lieutenant Dolan received a temporary, crucial reprieve. With their supporting tanks destroyed and unable to cross the causeway, the German grenadiers broke off their coordinated attack and retreated toward the hamlet of Coquigny. Soon after, the remaining elements of B Company arrived and were available for duty. Dolan strategically placed B Company immediately behind A Company, establishing a 360-degree perimeter to defend against any flanking maneuvers or future attacks. While the Germans regrouped and reorganized for their next assault, they maintained continuous pressure on the Americans. The paratroopers were subjected to a constant combination of artillery, heavy mortar, and machine gun fire that lasted until nightfall. Lieutenant Dolan specifically remembered the profound effectiveness of the enemy mortar fire. He noted that the mortar fire was highly effective against the 2 forward platoons because of tree bursts, where rounds detonated high in the branches, raining shrapnel downwards. He reflected that it required little imagination on the part of the Germans to accurately deduce exactly where the Americans would be forced to dig in. Dolan recalled that there was less than a 75-yard frontage on either side of the bridge from which the Americans could effectively mount a defense, allowing the Germans to throw their mortar fire into this general direction with devastating results. His 3rd platoon suffered the worst losses, being situated in a heavier wooded area where tree bursts were most lethal. The following morning, the incoming enemy fire intensified and then grew heavier still in the afternoon, clearly signaling the approach of another German attack. Dolan was positioned with his 1st platoon on the north side of the bridge when the mortar fire reached an even greater intensity, sustained for an hour. The 3rd platoon, situated on the south side of the bridge, was almost entirely wiped out. They suffered the loss of their platoon sergeant, Sergeant Monahan. Pinned down on the opposite side of the road, Dolan was unaware of the extent of the losses suffered by the 3rd platoon. A short time later, a dangerous rumor began to spread that American troops were retreating from the bridge. This panic was exacerbated by reports that some troops had retreated through the 3rd platoon's position and then moved through the command post. This confusion caused the crew of the 57mm anti-tank gun, believing the line had collapsed, to abandon their weapon. With the primary anti-tank weapon unmanned at this most critical of moments, the 2nd major German attack commenced. 4 more ex-French tanks, again supported by infantry, rumbled down the road toward the causeway. 2 tanks led the formation with the infantry following close behind, while the 2nd pair of tanks brought up the rear of the column. The American platoons positioned directly at the bridge opened fire, but they also absorbed heavy casualties, severely threatening the American ability to hold the bridgehead. To make matters worse, the unit radios failed, forcing the defenders to rely solely on runners to maintain crucial communication between the isolated units. 1st Platoon's leader, Lieutenant William Oakley, was gravely wounded and died shortly thereafter. Private Ross, who was carrying the platoon's walkie-talkie, a larger radio carried on the soldier's back, distinct from the smaller handheld handy-talkies of the World War II era, was also killed. This tragic loss left the platoon completely isolated, and a squad leader named William Owens assumed command.
As the German tanks continued to rumble relentlessly toward the bridge, Dolan noticed the unnerving silence of the 57mm gun. He was unaware that the crew had vacated the position. Dolan rushed back to the gun and found it abandoned. He attempted to fire it himself, but realized the crew had taken the firing mechanism when they left. In a moment of desperation, Dolan quickly assembled a small makeshift group of 5 or 6 paratroopers. He armed these men with gammon grenades. These were powerful handheld explosive charges that mandated the user to get extremely close, within throwing range to an enemy armored vehicle to effectively deploy them. This drastic measure meant the Americans would have to allow the enemy tanks to successfully cross the bridge so that the paratroopers could run up and attack them. With the primary anti-tank guns silent, there seemed to be no other viable option.
However, the situation changed dramatically when, entirely on their own initiative, 2 members of the original 57mm gun crew returned. They brought the firing mechanism with them. Dolan remembered them only as 2 privates, perhaps as young as 18 years old. The pair worked with intense speed to get the cannon back into action. Within minutes, they were firing 57mm anti-tank rounds directly at the lead German tanks. Both leading tanks were successfully knocked out shortly thereafter. Their hulks collapsed across the causeway, blocking the span alongside the tanks that had been destroyed earlier. Dolan immediately put both brave privates in for the Silver Star Award. With the 2 lead tanks demolished and blocking the road, the tanks bringing up the rear of the German formation were unable to bypass the wrecks and cross the bridge. Their crews made the tactical decision to pull back, likely choosing to remain out of range of the shockingly effective anti-tank fire the Americans had just demonstrated. Despite the loss of armored support, the German infantry continued to press forward, utilizing the destroyed tanks as essential cover. The crucial defensive advantage for the Americans remained the terrain. The waterlogged ground and marsh on either side of the causeway severely restricted the German infantry's ability to spread out. This terrain limitation made it easier for the American troops to concentrate their fire on the narrow front. The determined defense held, and the German infantry soon fell back, unable to overcome the concentrated wall of lead the American soldiers unleashed upon them. The German response shifted back to indirect fire. Artillery and heavy mortar fire descended upon the American position once more. Explosions peppered the east end of the bridge, sending lethal shrapnel flying over the American foxholes. After Lieutenant Oakley of the 1st Platoon fell wounded, Sergeant William Owens, who had taken command, began a dangerous crawl around the platoon's position. He meticulously checked every wounded or dead man for any remaining ammunition and grenades. He then distributed the scavenged supplies to his surviving men, preparing them for the next inevitable attack, all while under continuous artillery and mortar fire. Owens later wrote that he did not know how it was possible to live through it. By this point, his platoon had been reduced to only 15 fighting men. Another German attack materialized, this time consisting solely of infantry. The path for any further tanks remained completely blocked by the knocked-out hulks of their predecessors. Sergeant Owens fired at the advancing infantry with a .30 caliber machine gun, but the weapon quickly overheated. He crawled over to a wounded private named McClatchy, retrieved the soldier's Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, and began using it. Owens sent burst after burst of fire at the Germans, until he ran completely out of magazines for the heavy weapon. After exhausting the ammunition for the Browning automatic rifle, Owens moved to another .30 caliber machine gun. The crew of this gun lay dead, killed by a close artillery or mortar round. The machine gun's tripod was unusable due to damage, so Owens improvised, resting the weapon on a pile of dirt. Another soldier took up a different machine gun position. Behind them, a 60mm mortar crew began lobbing bombs toward the advancing Germans. Owens stated that the enemy was now within 25 yards of the 1st Platoon's decimated position. At this critical juncture, a runner appeared. He was one of the 505th's Pathfinders, soldiers who had jumped in before the main force to prepare the landing fields. His name was Bob Murphy. Murphy had joined the Army in 1942 at the age of 17, managing to enlist only after his own father helped him forge a birth certificate. Now serving as a communication runner, he was tasked with checking on A Company's desperate status.
Learning that the platoon was rapidly running out of both men and ammunition, Murphy ran back to Lieutenant Dolan's command post and delivered the grim report. Dolan scribbled a concise note on a small scrap of paper and instructed Murphy to take it immediately back to Sergeant Owens. The powerful note simply stated, "I know of no better spot to die. We stay." Sergeant Owens resolved to hold his post with his few remaining men. However, what felt like the absolute moment of their last stand suddenly and unexpectedly took a turn for the better. The intense firing abruptly died away. A flag displaying a Red Cross symbol appeared, waving visibly over the heads of the German troops gathered on the causeway. The Germans requested a temporary ceasefire, asking for a half-hour to remove their wounded. The Americans, who were themselves battered almost to their breaking point, quickly agreed to the truce. Owens moved even farther forward during the lull to gain a better view of the situation. He estimated that he saw roughly 200 German dead and wounded scattered across the causeway and in the surrounding Merderet River area. He also noted that it ultimately took the enemy approximately 2 hours to evacuate all of their wounded. After this period, the artillery and mortars resumed firing, though the barrages were slightly lighter than they had been previously. No further German infantry or armored vehicles appeared for the remainder of that day. As darkness fell, the paratroopers maintained a vigilant watch for another possible German attack. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, Sergeant Owens heard the distinct sound of engine noises coming from across the causeway. Fearing an impending night assault, he listened intently. He soon realized that the sound was the Germans attempting to use an armored vehicle to push one of the disabled American-destroyed tanks out of the way, clearing the blockage. Owens knew that if the enemy succeeded in getting tanks across the bridge, the Americans possessed very little remaining strength to stop them. He quickly grabbed a few gammon grenades and began crawling silently onto the bridge itself. He was invisible to the enemy forces in the deep darkness. Debris, equipment, and bodies littered the span as he slowly made his way across the narrow path. He guided his movement only by the sounds of the enemy troops working to open a path. Owens estimated he got to within 30 or 40 yards of the Germans before he decided to throw his first grenade. The gammon grenade operated differently from a standard hand grenade. The user first unscrewed a protective cap on the top of the weapon, which exposed a small ribbon with a weighted end. Once the grenade was thrown, the ribbon rapidly uncoiled. The resistance of the air caused the ribbon to pull a small pin from the fuse, arming the gammon so that it would explode immediately upon hitting anything. Owens unscrewed the cap on his gammon and hurled it forcefully toward the sound of the active tank engine. However, in the oppressive darkness, his aim was slightly off, and the grenade struck the already disabled tank instead. The resulting explosion sent a powerful blast wave and shrapnel flying through the night air. While the explosion did not knock out the active armored vehicle, it immediately alerted the tank's crew to the unseen threat lurking in the darkness. The driver quickly slammed the tank into reverse and backed it out of range of the bridgehead. The shelling resumed after this intense incident, but it proved to be the absolute last German attempt to retake control of the crucial bridge. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Alexander arrived and assumed command of the battalion, providing much-needed relief to Lieutenant Dolan. That night, A Company was finally relieved of its exhausting duty to hold the Fière Bridge by elements of the 508th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment. During the grueling fight to successfully hold the position, A Company suffered significant casualties, losing 17 men dead and approximately 51 wounded, according to Lieutenant Dolan's records. Results, discussion, and heroism. The successful stand at the Fière Bridge was a microcosm of the entire D-Day airborne operation, characterized by confusion, immense casualties, and extraordinary individual heroism. The paratroopers, though lightly armed compared to the standard foot soldiers, carried significant amounts of gear, sometimes exceeding 75 pounds in load. Their ability to secure and maintain control over the Fière causeway, despite being heavily engaged by determined German infantry and repeated armored attacks, was a testament to their professionalism and vital training. The immediate tactical result was the successful interdiction of German movement. By holding the bridge, the Americans effectively prevented the deployment of enemy forces, specifically the Grenadier Regiment 1057 and the captured French tanks of Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion 100, from reaching Saint-Mère-Église and threatening the crucial N13 road needed for coastal defense or counterattack. The causeway, elevated and surrounded by a flooded marshland, became a death trap for the advancing German armor once the first few vehicles were disabled.
A critical element of the American success was the ability of the officers and non-commissioned officers to maintain order and cohesion during the initial chaos.
Lieutenant Dolan's quick orientation skills, rooted in extensive night training and map study, allowed A Company to assemble 90% of its strength and move directly to the objective. When casualties mounted and command shifted rapidly from Major Kellum to Lieutenant Dolan after Kellum was killed by mortar fire, Dolan was able to instantly assume command of the battalion and maintain the defensive integrity. The fight emphasized the crucial importance of specialized anti-tank weaponry. The Germans utilized captured but effective French tanks. The Americans countered these threats using the 57mm anti-tank gun and the shoulder-fired bazooka. The performance of the bazooka teams was exemplary. Marcus Heim, Lenold Peterson, John Bolderson, and Gordon Prine faced down tanks at point-blank range, firing calmly despite heavy enemy fire. Heim's perilous dash across the road under fire to retrieve additional rockets highlighted the determination required to keep these essential weapons operating. The dedication of the 7 men who died ensuring the 57mm gun remained in action despite being repeatedly hit proved that the heaviest weapon available to the paratroopers was indispensable in halting the armored breakthroughs. The collective anti-tank fire destroyed 3 tanks in the first attack and 2 in the second, securing the bridge. Individual acts of leadership under overwhelming pressure defined the defense. Sergeant William Owens, upon assuming command of the severely depleted 1st Platoon, demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness. His actions of crawling under heavy fire to redistribute ammunition from the dead and wounded to his surviving men, and his seamless transition between weapons from a machine gun to a Browning automatic rifle and then to another machine gun, epitomized the tenacity of the defending troops. His unwavering commitment crystallized in the resolute note sent back to Lieutenant Dolan, "I know of no better spot to die. We stay," perfectly captured the desperate yet determined state of the defense.
Furthermore, Owens's solo night reconnaissance and attack using gammon grenades to deter the Germans from clearing the causeway blockage showcased initiative vital for survival. Despite his heroism at La Fière, Dolan's recommendation of Sergeant Owens for the Distinguished Service Cross was not granted. A fact Dolan noted was a story in itself. However, Owens was later promoted to Staff Sergeant and received a Silver Star during Operation Market Garden in Holland in September 1944 for actions similar to those he performed at the Merderet River. Meanwhile, the bazooka teams, Marcus Heim, Lenold Peterson, John Bolderson, and Gordon Prine all received the Distinguished Service Cross for their bravery against the German tanks. The cost of holding the bridge for the Americans was heavy. A Company alone reported 17 dead and approximately 51 wounded during the fight. However, the German casualties were substantial and had a far greater strategic impact. While the exact German casualties at the bridge cannot be precisely determined, the 91st Air Landing Division lost 2,212 men during the initial 6 days of the fighting in Normandy. Following further intense combat, the division was effectively mauled and ceased to exist entirely by August 10, 1944. The successful seizure and tenacious holding of the La Fière Bridge by the 82nd Airborne Division troops contributed directly to the broader strategic success of Operation Overlord. These actions, along with the other airborne missions, enabled thousands of Allied troops to come ashore on the beaches and carry the fight inland to the German defenders. The securing of these key points paved the way for the ultimate Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead and the subsequent rapid advance all the way to the German border by mid-September.
The role of Sergeant William Owens transcends mere duty. His methodical, selfless movement along the line to gather and distribute ammunition ensured that the remaining 15 men of his platoon maintained their fighting capability. His use of multiple weapons after his primary machine gun overheated or ran out of ammunition highlights the reliance on every available resource during sustained combat. Owens's final confrontation in the early hours of the following morning, silently crawling across the debris-strewn bridge to launch gammon grenades at the German vehicle attempting to clear the wreckage, secured the success of the previous day's sacrifices. By preventing the removal of the tank hulks, he ensured the causeway remained blocked to further German armor, thus effectively ending the enemy's attempts to take the bridge by force. The request for the truce to remove the German wounded suggests the intensity of the engagement. Sergeant Owens's estimation of approximately 200 German dead and wounded around the immediate area of the causeway attests to the effectiveness of the American concentrated fire in the narrow choke point. The sheer volume of casualties sustained by the German 91st Air Landing Division in the first week, ultimately leading to its destruction, shows that the paratroopers successfully fulfilled their primary strategic mission of bleeding the German reserve and preventing an organized counterattack against the vulnerable beachheads. The events at La Fière Bridge represent a successful model of defensive deployment and resource management in an isolated environment. The engineers, though their ultimate mission was to demolish the bridge, contributed immediately by laying mines and establishing physical obstacles. The machine gun and mortar teams, despite their ammunition shortages, provided necessary fire support. The success was not achieved through superior numbers or heavy armor, but through the judicious application of limited resources, maximizing the effectiveness of every weapon and relying on the unparalleled tenacity of the highly trained volunteer forces. The collective determination displayed from Lieutenant Dolan down to Private Heim and Private Peterson established the foundation for the ultimate Allied success in Normandy. The story of the defense of La Fière is interwoven with the larger, crucial narrative of the liberation of Europe. The operation, codenamed Boston for the 82nd Airborne Division, was an overwhelming commitment. The successful execution of the mission required every component to perform, often beyond the scope of initial planning. The scattering of units, while initially chaotic, ultimately increased the strain on the German LXXV-4 Corps, forcing them to react widely across the countryside to myriad small threats rather than concentrating on the strategic objectives. The early death of Generalleutnant Wilhelm Fally, the German division commander, further exacerbated the enemy's inability to organize a swift, coherent response. Ambushed by Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan and a few paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Fally's death immediately created a leadership vacuum and added to the German division's confusion. The subsequent loss of communication with the troops defending La Fière Bridge by 3:30 o'clock in the morning meant that the German commanders were fighting blind, unable to effectively coordinate the counterattacks that followed later that day. The lessons learned at La Fière underscore the importance of disciplined action during the most chaotic phases of combat. Lieutenant Dolan's emphasis on map study and night training paid dividends not just in initial orientation, but also in the ability of his non-commissioned officers to reorganize their men quickly amidst heavy fire. When the 3rd Platoon lost Lieutenant McLaughlin and its platoon leader Lieutenant Coxon, the remaining sergeants and corporals were able to hold their position and reorganize until Dolan returned. The fierce commitment to holding the objective, despite the horrific toll of casualties, defines the legacy of the paratroopers involved. The unwavering resolve of Sergeant Owens, who continued to fight after his entire platoon had been decimated, ensured that the line did not break. His leadership demonstrated that even when conventional communication fails and ammunition runs out, the will to fight remains the ultimate determinant of success.
The official recognition of heroism, such as the Distinguished Service Cross awarded to the Bazooka teams, correctly highlighted the decisive moments of the battle, where lightly armed men stood up against armored vehicles and won. The story of Sergeant Owens, who was denied the Distinguished Service Cross for La Fière, but later earned the Silver Star, hints at the complex and often imperfect process of military awards, but does not diminish the impact of his actions in securing the position. His defiance, embodied in the note, "We stay," is a poignant symbol of the paratroopers' commitment to their assigned task, regardless of the personal cost. The ultimate destruction of the 91st Air Landing Division following the Normandy campaign confirms the strategic success of the initial airborne objectives. By seizing and holding the vital choke points like La Fière, the 82nd Airborne Division ensured that the German defense was fractured, disjointed, and consumed by costly local battles. The stand at the Merderet River was therefore not just a successful tactical defense, but a foundational pillar upon which the entire larger success of Operation Overlord was built, allowing the Allied forces to gain and maintain the critical momentum necessary for the liberation of Europe. The All-Americans, having fought through the intense defense of La Fière, would continue their dedication to the war effort through subsequent airborne actions in Holland and the grueling winter fighting in the Ardennes. Conclusion. Key takeaways and reflections. The defense of the La Fière Bridge during the opening hours of the Normandy invasion stands as a monumental illustration of disciplined tenacity and individual valor in the face of mechanized assault. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, specifically A Company of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, successfully executed their mission to seize and hold this vital crossing point over the Merderet River. Their success was not guaranteed.
It was bought with heavy casualties and maintained against repeated, determined counterattacks supported by tanks and heavy artillery. The key takeaway from this engagement is the profound importance of professional military preparation. The extensive night training allowed Lieutenant Dolan's company to successfully navigate the darkness and assemble quickly, avoiding the fate of many units scattered miles off target. This initial organizational success allowed them to seize the objective before the German 91st Air Landing Division could fully mobilize and respond. Furthermore, the battle highlights the critical role of light anti-tank capabilities in airborne operations. The destruction of 7 German tanks, despite the immense loss of 7 Americans at the 57mm gun alone, was the essential action that secured the defense. The bravery of soldiers like Heim, Peterson, Boulderson, and Prime, who calmly engaged armored targets at extremely close range with bazookas, prevented a catastrophic German breakthrough that would have jeopardized the entire Utah Beach corridor. Finally, the defense of La Fière embodies the concept of holding the line until the end. Sergeant William Owens' actions, from scavenging ammunition to his quiet defiance against the German attempt to clear the causeway, personify the resolve necessary to withstand continuous bombardment and infantry attacks. The successful stand at La Fière ensured that the chaos of the airborne drop ultimately served its strategic purpose, enabling thousands of other troops to land safely and begin the advance inland. The All-Americans' legacy is therefore permanently marked by the desperate, victorious fight for that small causeway over the flooded Merderet River.